A forgotten alleyway holds the answer to a city's flood. We walk past things every day we label useless, only to discover later they were vital all along. This is the heart of an ancient paradox from Taoism, a philosophy that turns our idea of value completely upside down. It is called the utility of uselessness. By the end of this, you will see how embracing what seems pointless can be the secret to a more peaceful and resilient life. What if everything we chase for its obvious use is actually leading us toward exhaustion, while what we ignore holds the key to real strength? We are about to explore a collection of strange and beautiful stories that challenge every modern instinct about purpose and success. They ask us to reconsider the crooked tree, the empty boat, and the broken tool. What is one thing you currently consider completely useless in your own life? One of the most famous stories on this idea comes from the ancient sage zhuangzi. A master carpenter named Shi was traveling with his apprentices through a mountain forest when they came upon a truly enormous tree. It stood taller than 100 men, with a trunk so wide a dozen people could not link arms around it. Its branches were thick and gnarled, twisting in every direction, creating a vast canopy of shade. The apprentices stared in awe. They had never seen such magnificent timber. They immediately began to discuss its potential. They could build a palace from this wood or a fleet of ships. The master carpenter, however, did not even slow his pace. He walked right past the colossal tree without a second glance. Puzzled, his apprentices hurried after him. Why, they asked, did you ignore such a perfect tree? It is useless, the carpenter replied simply. Its wood is too soft and knotty. If you tried to make a boat from it, the boat would sink. If you tried to make a coffin, the coffin would rot. It is good for nothing. That is why it has been allowed to grow so large and old. That night, the giant tree appeared to the carpenter in a dream, and it spoke. You are right to compare me to those other trees, the apple tree, the pear tree, the cypress, and the pine, it said. As soon as their fruit ripens, they are plundered and their branches broken. Their usefulness causes them constant suffering. They never live out their natural years, but are cut down in their prime by axes and saws, and all this because the world finds them useful. My goal from the beginning was to be useless. I twisted my trunk on purpose. I made my wood soft, and yes, I became useless to you, but look at what my uselessness has granted me. I have achieved a great age. I provide shelter for birds and insects, for travelers seeking rest. My uselessness is my very purpose. This is the paradox laid bare. The tree's value did not come from fitting into a human plan. Its value came from following its own nature, what Taoism calls zhuangzi, or naturalness. It grew crooked not as a flaw, but as an act of profound self-preservation. It practiced wu-wei, effortless action, by simply being what it was without striving to be a straight, useful piece of timber. Its apparent flaws were its greatest strengths. This story asks us a difficult question. How often do we judge the world and even ourselves by the standard of the carpenter? We see a crooked path in life and call it a mistake. We see a quiet season of rest and label it unproductive. We see a personality that does not fit the mold and consider it broken. The Taoist view suggests we have it backwards. The straight tree is the first to be cut down. The person constantly proving their usefulness is often the first to burn out. What if, like the tree, our supposed imperfections are not obstacles to be fixed, but protective features that allow us to endure? They are the very things that let us grow vast, provide shade for others, and live a life that is truly our own. The carpenter's tree was not the only one to find safety in its apparent flaws. Centuries later, another story emerged from the same tradition, this time about a man. In the state of Chu lived a man named Shu, though people often called him Shu the discombobulated. He had a severely hunched back, his spine curved like a question mark. In a society that valued strength for farming and fighting, Shu was considered completely useless. He could not till a field straight, he could not lift a heavy load, he could not even look a lord in the eye. He was, by every common measure, a burden. Then came the conscription drive. The local officials moved through the villages, selecting strong, able-bodied men to serve in the Lord's army. They lined up the young men, inspecting their arms and their posture. When they came to Shu, they looked him up and down, shook their heads, and moved on without a word. He was passed over, he was left behind. While his neighbors, the so-called useful men, were marched off to war, Shu remained in his village. He watched them go, their usefulness now a sentence to potential injury or death on a distant battlefield. In that moment, his uselessness transformed. His deformity was not a curse but a shield. It was a form of protection so complete it required no effort at all. This story cuts to a brutal truth about how societies often operate. The definition of usefulness is rarely about your well-being. It is about what can be extracted from you. Your strength is useful for carrying burdens. Your obedience is useful for following orders. Your productivity is useful for filling coffers. To be labeled useful in this system is to be made a candidate for exploitation and sacrifice. Shu's crooked back made him invisible to that machine. It disqualified him from a game he could never win. His flaw was, in a very real sense, his freedom. Taoism has a word for this kind of hidden advantage. It is called de, often translated as virtue or power. But this is not virtue in a moralistic sense, and not power as force or dominance. De is the inherent potency that comes from being perfectly aligned with your own nature. The giant tree had de in its soft, knotty wood. Shu had de in his crooked spine. It was an unassailable strength precisely because it looked like weakness to the outside world. It was a power that did not need to fight because it existed outside the terms of the conflict altogether. So we must ask ourselves what in our own lives feels like a disqualifying flaw. A sensitivity others call weakness, a pace they call slow, a dream they call impractical. Could it be that this very thing is your de, your hidden advantage, quietly protecting you from paths of exhaustion and aligning you with a deeper, more sustainable way? There is another story, this one set on a quiet river, that takes the idea of uselessness even further. A man is rowing his small skiff down a gentle waterway, lost in thought. The day is calm, the water smooth. Suddenly, out of nowhere, another boat drifts directly into his path. It collides with his skiff with a jarring thud. In an instant, the man's peace shatters. His face flushes with heat. He leaps to his feet, shouting insults at the other vessel. He shakes his fist, demanding to know what fool is piloting so carelessly. He is ready for a fight, but then, as the ripples settle, he sees the truth. The other boat is completely empty. It is just an old skiff, its mooring rope snapped, drifting with the current. There is no pilot, there is no intention, there is no one to blame, and just like that, the man's anger evaporates. He might even laugh at himself, sitting back down, his outrage seeming suddenly foolish. All his fury was directed at a story he had written in his own mind, a narrative of disrespect and agency where none existed. The empty boat, by being utterly useless, by having no pilot, no purpose, no will of its own, could not be an enemy. It was simply a fact of the river. This parable reveals a profound source of our daily suffering. We are constantly colliding with empty boats. A terse email from a colleague, a sudden rainstorm that ruins a plan, a global event that shifts the market, a stranger's careless remark. Our first instinctive reaction is to assume a pilot. We assign intention. We believe the universe or some person within it has deliberately steered into us. We construct a narrative of blame, and within that story, our ego takes a hit. We feel disrespected, thwarted, victimized. The emotional storm that follows is entirely of our own making, a reaction not to the event itself, but to the phantom pilot we have placed at the helm. The uselessness of the empty boat is its greatest teaching. It cannot be insulted, it cannot be threatened, it cannot be engaged in conflict. It is invulnerable because it is empty. Taoism suggests we can cultivate a similar state within ourselves, not by becoming passive, but by practicing what is called wu-wei, or egoless action. This is the art of acting in the world without the heavy baggage of a rigid, fragile self-importance. It means doing your work, rowing your boat, but without being so tightly identified with every outcome, every slight, every collision. When you become a little more like the empty boat, when your sense of self is not a fortified castle to be defended at all costs, the chaos of the world loses its power to provoke you. A criticism becomes mere feedback, not an assault. A change of plans becomes a new current, not a personal betrayal. You navigate the river of life with less friction because you stop fighting the drift of things that were never under your control, and more importantly, that were never about you in the first place. So the next time you feel that familiar heat of anger rising, pause. Ask this simple, liberating question: is there a pilot in that other boat, or am I shouting at the wind and the current? The answer might just empty the conflict, leaving you floating peacefully once more, ready to see what lies around the next bend. This freedom found in emptiness brings us to a story about gourds and a failure of imagination. A man named Uselessness was a skilled farmer and a practical thinker. He once managed to grow a crop of gourds of truly astonishing size. Each one was as large as a barrel with a thick, hard rind. Uselessness was initially proud of his achievement, but his practical mind immediately went to work on the problem of their use. He tried to turn one into a water dipper. It was far too large and heavy. No one could lift it when it was full. He then considered hollowing one out to use as a giant storage jar, but the rind, while hard, was not strong enough to hold its shape under the weight of grain or water. It would simply collapse. Uselessness stood before his magnificent harvest, frustrated. All this potential, he thought, and yet they are utterly useless. In a fit of disappointment, he took an axe and smashed every single one of them to pieces. When his friend Zhuangzi heard about this, he could only sigh at the waste. He said to Uselessness, "You were so fixated on the idea of a container that you blinded yourself to every other possibility. You thought only in terms of holding water or grain, but consider the gourd's true nature. It is large and it is buoyant. What if, instead of trying to make it hold something, you allowed it to hold you? You could have tied several of those giant gourds together into a raft. Then you could have spent your days floating idly on the rivers and lakes, drifting with the current without a care in the world. Would that not have been a use, and what a sublime use it would have been? Here, the lesson of uselessness shifts from passive protection to active reimagination. Uselessness's gourds were not inherently useless. They were simply useless for the narrow, rigid purposes he had predefined. His mind was locked in a category. A gourd is a container, therefore its only value lies in how well it contains. When it failed that one test, he destroyed it. Zhuangzi shattered that category entirely. A gourd is not a container, it is a shape, a volume, a floating pod. Its value could be found not in utility, but in experience, in freedom, in leisure. The raft was not a tool for a chore, it was a vessel for a state of being. We all have our own gourds. These are the skills, traits, or opportunities that we judge harshly because they do not fit the standard job description of our lives. A talent for daydreaming seems useless in a deadline-driven job. A deep knowledge of ancient history seems useless in a tech startup. A gentle, non-competitive nature seems useless in a cutthroat industry. Like Uselessness, we are tempted to smash these parts of ourselves, to dismiss them as impractical, and get on with the serious business of being useful. But what if we stopped asking, "What is this for?" and started asking, "What could this become in a different context?" That daydreaming mind might be the source of your most creative solution. That historical knowledge might provide the perfect analogy for a modern problem. That gentle nature might be the exact skill needed to de-escalate a team conflict. The gourd is not the problem, the frame is. The raft on the lake is a powerful symbol of this liberated perspective. It represents a use that serves no external master, that creates no product for market. Its purpose is inner peace, observation, and harmony with the flow of nature. It is useful for living, not just for producing. This story asks us to expand our definition of value beyond the transactional. Can we tie together the seemingly unmarketable parts of our lives into something that carries us toward joy? Can we look at what we have labeled a failure of function and see instead a possibility for freedom? The answer often lies not in changing the gourd, but in changing the river we choose to float on. Uselessness smashed his gourds because he could not see past their solid form. But what if the most important part of any form is not the form itself, but the void it contains? The ancient text, the Tao Te Ching, offers a startlingly simple image to illustrate this. We shape clay into a pot, it says, but it is the emptiness inside that holds whatever we want. Pause on that for just a moment. The potter spends hours at the wheel, their skilled hands coaxing the spinning clay upward into a beautiful, symmetrical vessel. We admire the curve of its sides, the glaze on its surface, the craftsmanship of its creation. Yet every single function of that pot, every reason for its existence, depends entirely on the part that is not there. The hollow space, without that emptiness, the pot is just a solid lump of ceramic, a paperweight, a curiosity. Its usefulness is born from its nothingness. This principle is everywhere, hiding in plain sight. A window is not a window because of its wooden frame, but because of the open space that lets in the light and the view. A pipe is not a pipe because of the metal surrounding it, but because of the hollow channel through which water can flow. A wheel turns not because of its wooden spokes, but because of the empty hole at its very center where the axle sits. In every case, the thing we touch and see and call real, the clay, the wood, the metal, exists only to define a space of non-being, and it is that non-being, that emptiness, that does all the work. This is the philosophical cornerstone of the utility of uselessness. The Taoists called it the relationship between being, which is you, the solid, tangible world, and non-being, which they called Wu. They are not opposites locked in battle. They are interdependent partners, two sides of the same reality. The wheel cannot turn without its empty hub. You cannot have a room without the space contained by the walls. You cannot have sound without the silent pauses between the notes. Our culture is obsessed with being. We build our identities on what we have, what we do, what we have achieved, the solid clay of our lives. We polish our surfaces and define our edges, but this ancient view suggests we are missing half of the equation. The real power, the real capacity, lies in our Wu, in our own inner emptiness. This is not a bleak void, but a receptive, yielding, unformed potential. It is the quiet mind that can receive a new idea. It is the open schedule that can accommodate a spontaneous opportunity. It is the humility of not knowing which allows for true learning. It is the stillness in your heart that makes room for peace when the world is loud. When your life feels too full, too solid, too packed with obligations and possessions and rigid plans, there is no space for anything new to enter. You become like a pot filled to the brim with solid clay, beautiful perhaps, but functionally useless. The value is in the empty interior. So what might it look like to cultivate a little more Wu in your own life? It could be the conscious act of creating margins in your day, empty spaces with no agenda. It could be practicing listening more than speaking, allowing the silence between words to hold meaning. It could be letting go of an old grievance, creating an empty chamber where compassion can eventually flow in. You are not just the clay of your accomplishments. You are also the vital, necessary emptiness that gives them all meaning and purpose. The next time you feel the pressure to be constantly solid, constantly productive, constantly full, remember the potter's wheel. The masterpiece is not the vessel you see, it is the open space you cannot. Even the greatest sages can become prisoners of their own wisdom. The Taoist texts, particularly the writings of Zhuangzi, often turn a playful yet piercing eye toward the most revered figures of their time, especially Confucius. In these stories, Confucius is not a villain but a poignant figure, a man so dedicated to his system of rituals, rules, and social order that he becomes blind to the spontaneous flow of life happening right in front of him. He is portrayed as perpetually busy, traveling from state to state, offering his useful advice on governance and morality, yet often meeting with failure or ridicule. His knowledge, vast and impressive, becomes a kind of cage. He is trapped by the very thing he believes will save the world. Meanwhile, the characters who often reveal the deeper truth to him are those society deems useless or insane. The madman of Chu who sings wildly in the marketplace, the one-legged criminal, the hunchbacked gardener. These figures, unburdened by the need to be respectable or useful, possess a direct, unmediated connection to the way things are. They live their Zuren, their naturalness, without a rulebook. One of the most striking contrasts comes in the stories of the robber Zhai. While Confucius is the paragon of virtue and order, Robber Zhai is his shadow, a legendary bandit who leads an army of 9,000 followers, pillaging villages and defying every social convention. In one famous encounter, Confucius decides to use his eloquence and moral reasoning to persuade Robber Zhai to mend his ways. He arrives at the bandits' camp, bows with perfect etiquette, and launches into a magnificent speech about the virtues of loyalty, filial piety, and the honorable life of a gentleman. He offers Robber Zhai a path to usefulness, to respectability, to a legacy. Robber Zhai listens, then erupts in laughter. He mocks Confucius for his hypocrisy, pointing out that all his talk of virtue is just a tool for seeking favor with rulers. He argues that Confucius' rigid rules are unnatural, a distortion of human instinct. Your so-called wisdom, the bandit says in essence, is useless to me. It does not feed my hunger, it does not match the reality I see, and it chains men to a system that serves the powerful. My way, lawless as it seems to you, is at least authentically mine. The shock of the story is not that Robber Zhai is right, but that he holds up a mirror. He exposes how even the highest conventional wisdom can become a kind of currency, a performance, something traded for status rather than lived as truth. His uselessness, his outright rejection of the entire social game, grants him a clarity that the sage, for all his learning, has lost. This theme cuts even closer in a quieter story, a conversation between a wheelwright and a duke. The duke is seated in his hall, reading aloud from the ancient scrolls of the sages. The wheelwright named Payan is working outside, chiseling a wheel. He puts down his tools, walks in, and asks the duke what he is reading. The words of the ancient sages, the duke replies proudly. Payan then asks, are those sages still alive? No, the duke says, they are long dead. Then the wheelwright says bluntly, what you are reading is nothing but the dregs of old men. Astonished and insulted, the duke demands an explanation. The wheelwright offers one from his own craft. To chisel a perfect wheel, he explains, the work must be neither too slow nor too fast. The motion must come from the hand and the heart in a perfect, intuitive rhythm. This knowledge is in my bones, I feel it. I cannot explain it to my own son, and he cannot learn it just by watching me. It cannot be written down in words. The ancient sages you revere, they too had knowledge that lived in their bones, knowledge of life itself, of the Tao. That vital essence died with them. What remains in your books are just the dead shells, the empty words. The things worth knowing cannot be taught. The duke is left speechless, holding a scroll that has just been declared useless. The lesson here is devastating to any culture obsessed with credentials and canonical knowledge. It suggests that an over-reliance on prescribed wisdom, on the frozen formulas of the past, is not just unhelpful, it is actively harmful. It separates you from the living, breathing, ever-changing reality of the Tao, which must be felt and experienced directly, like the wheelwright's chisel in the wood. We do this constantly. We cling to life hack articles, to rigid self-help rules, to the advice of gurus, to the way things have always been done. We treat these things as useful manuals, hoping they will spare us the uncertainty of finding our own rhythm. But the Taoist warning is that this very search for a fixed, useful system can leave us more lost, trying to follow a map while ignoring the terrain under our feet. The wheelwright's knowing was useless for writing a book, but it was essential for creating something real. So where does that leave us? Must we burn our books and abandon all teachers? Not at all. The point is to hold knowledge lightly, like a tool, not a prison. To understand that the deepest truths, how to live, how to create, how to be at peace, are not transmitted through words alone, but through a kind of humble, patient apprenticeship to life itself. They are found in the silent space between instructions, in the failure of a plan that leads to a new path, in the laugh of a madman that shatters our certainty. The most useful thing we can do, paradoxically, might be to occasionally set aside what we think we know and simply pay attention to what is. The wheelwright's chisel finds its rhythm not in a manual, but in the quiet space between thoughts. This is where our modern world grows deafeningly loud. We have turned the concept of usefulness into a relentless engine, one that demands every minute be optimized, every hobby monetized, and every relationship leveraged. We chase a state of perfect, frictionless productivity, believing it is the path to security and success. Yet this very pursuit, this idolization of constant output, is the precise recipe for the hollow exhaustion we call burnout. The ancient stories of crooked trees and empty boats are not relics. They are urgent diagnostics for a culture that has forgotten how to be still, how to be empty, how to be, in the most vital sense, useless. Consider the last time you did something with absolutely no goal in mind. Not a walk to hit 10,000 steps, but a stroll to notice the cracks in the pavement and the shape of the clouds. Not sketching to post online, but doodling in a margin because your hand felt like moving. Not reading to gain a competitive edge, but reading to get lost in a sentence. These acts are the modern equivalent of the giant gourd raft. They serve no external master, produce no measurable outcome, and generate no revenue. By the standards of the productivity engine, they are wasteful. But by the standards of your own humanity, they are essential. They are the empty space in the clay pot of your life. Without them, there is no room for anything new to enter, no inspiration, no peace, no sudden connection. Neuroscience now echoes what the Taoists felt in their bones. When we daydream, when we let our minds wander without a destination, we activate a network in the brain called the default mode. This is not downtime. This is the workshop where our subconscious connects disparate ideas, solves problems we've been grinding on, and generates genuine creativity. The programmer stuck on a bug who goes for a walk often returns with the solution, not because she was working, but because she stopped. The artist's most breakthrough idea often arrives not at the desk, but in the shower. These are not accidents, they are the fruits of cultivated uselessness. By stepping off the treadmill of utility, we allow a deeper, more intelligent part of ourselves to do its work. The contrast is stark. On one side, the rat race, a life measured in metrics, notifications, and the anxious hustle to prove your worth. It is the straight tree in the carpenter's forest, prized for its obvious utility and perpetually at risk of the axe. On the other side, the peace of simply being, the crooked tree in the forest growing at its own pace, providing shade not because it was ordered to, but because that is its nature. This peace is not laziness, it is a profound alignment. It is what happens when you stop shouting at empty boats and instead feel the current of your own life. It is the silent meditation that creates clarity, the hobby with no monetary value that restores your soul, the aimless walk that helps you remember who you are when no one is asking for anything. So what might it look like to invite a little deliberate uselessness into your week? It could be sitting with a cup of tea and doing nothing but listening to the rain for 10 minutes. It could be picking up an instrument with no intention of ever performing. It could be turning off the podcast during your commute and just watching the world go by. In these moments, you are not a tool for a purpose. You are a human being practicing the art of existence. You are hollowing out the center of your own pot, creating capacity. And in that empty, quiet space, you might just hear the faint, guiding whisper of your own path, what the ancients called the Tao, waiting to be discovered not through striving, but through the gentle, useless act of paying attention. Water does not argue its usefulness, yet nothing is more essential for life. It flows without a plan, seeking only the lowest, most empty places, the cracks in the stone, the forgotten riverbed, the hollow ground we would call useless. It does not strive to be a tool. It does not try to be hard or sharp to prove its worth. It is soft, yielding, and profoundly adaptable. And because of this, over time, it carves canyons, shapes continents, and quenches every thirst. This is the grand, quiet paradox that all our stories have been circling. The highest utility is not found in the rigid pursuit of purpose, but in the graceful embrace of what seems to the striving mind entirely without purpose. The crooked tree attains great age, the empty boat cannot be angered, the hollow gourd becomes a vessel for freedom. The person who stops performing usefulness for the world begins to embody a usefulness that is unshakable. This is the ultimate synthesis of the Taoist view. When you are no longer a tool shaped for another's hand, you become like water. You find your own level, your own natural course. Your resilience is not a force you muster, but a flexibility you inherit from not resisting every current. Your influence is not something you demand, but a presence you exert by simply being full, clear, and at peace. Think of the carpenter's tree. Its usefulness was not in a palace or a coffin. Its usefulness was in its enduring existence, a sanctuary for life, a testament to time. Its use was being itself completely. That is the usefulness of longevity. Consider the empty boat. Its uselessness to a pilot made it invulnerable to conflict. It could not be engaged, and thus it moved through the world without creating friction or suffering. That is the usefulness of peace. Remember Shu the discombobulated. His uselessness for war was his salvation. His apparent flaw was his protective virtue, his da. That is the usefulness of resilience. Recall Huizi's gourd. When it failed as a dipper, it succeeded as a raft. Its value was unlocked not by fitting a narrow function, but by inspiring a new way of being. That is the usefulness of creative freedom. And the wheelwright, with knowledge in his bones that could not be written down, his uselessness for scholarly debate was his direct connection to the living Tao. That is the usefulness of authentic knowing. Each one, by accepting their so-called useless trait, entered a state of wu-wei effortless action. They stopped swimming against the current of their own nature. And in that surrender to what is, they gained a power that purposeful striving could never achieve. This is not a passive life, it is an aligned life. The person integrated in this way is like a deep, clear pool. They do not need to shout to be heard. Their calm is contagious. Their decisions come from a centered place, not from reactive fear or hungry ambition. They become useful not because they are trying to be, but because their very wholeness is a resource for their own spirit, for their loved ones, for anyone caught in the storm who needs a reminder of the still point beneath the waves. The world will always need straight timber and sharp tools, but it desperately needs the crooked forests and the quiet waters too. It needs the spaces where nothing is being produced so that everything can be renewed. Your highest purpose, then, may not look like a purpose at all. It may look like the empty space in the pot, the hollow channel in the pipe, the yielding path of the river. It may feel like rest when you should be productive, like silence when you should have an answer, like following a curious whim that leads nowhere obvious. In those moments, you are not being useless. You are practicing the deepest utility of all. You are making room for the Tao to flow through you, shaping a life that is authentically, resiliently, and peacefully your own. A river does not need to be told its purpose is to reach the sea. It simply follows the path of least resistance, and in doing so, it nourishes everything along its banks. This is the quiet truth at the heart of every story we have shared. The giant tree, the hunchbacked man, the empty boat, the gourd raft, the wheelwright's silent knowledge, each one in its own way redefines what it means to be valuable. They teach us that the most potent forms of strength are often disguised as softness, that the most enduring forms of security are found in what appears vulnerable, and that the truest forms of knowledge cannot be captured in a manual. The unifying theme is a radical invitation to look beyond the societal metrics that measure us. Our culture prizes the straight timber, the productive output, the filled calendar, the credentialed expert. These stories ask us to honor the crooked forest, the empty space, the quiet mind, the wisdom in our bones. The utility of uselessness is not a philosophy of laziness or nihilism. It is a philosophy of alignment. It is an invitation to question the very drives that exhaust us, to find profound value in the state of being rather than the frenzy of doing, and to recognize the hidden architecture of a life well lived, one built not on relentless acquisition but on receptive presence. When you embody this, you become like water. You stop shouting at the current and start flowing with it. Your resilience becomes a natural flexibility. Your influence becomes a calm depth that others are drawn to. Your life stops being a performance of usefulness for an external audience and becomes an authentic expression of your own nature. So here is a simple, reflective call to action. Look around your own life right now. Identify one thing, just one, that you have labeled as completely useless. It might be an old hobby you gave up because it would never make money. It might be a personality trait like daydreaming or moving slowly that you have tried to suppress. It might be a quiet half hour in your day with no agenda that you feel guilty for not filling. Now reconsider it through the lens of these ancient stories. What if its uselessness is its very point? What hidden strength, what peace, what creative freedom might it be protecting or making space for? Could that old hobby be your gourd raft, a vessel for pure joy? Could that quiet half hour be the empty hub of your wheel, the still center that allows everything else to turn? We would love to hear what you discover. In the comments below, share your own useless thing or a paradox from your life that echoes these ideas. Your story might be the very clue someone else needs to see the value in their own crooked path. And if you would like to continue this exploration of ancient wisdom for modern life, consider subscribing. There are always more rivers to explore, more quiet truths waiting in the forgotten alleys of human understanding. Thank you for listening, and may you find great utility in your own beautifully useless moments.